Of all the grand illusions of history, none is more seductive, more enduring, than that of the fairy tale princess. We picture a life lived behind the velvet ropes of palaces, a world of silk gowns, glittering tiaras, and storybook romance, safely insulated from the harsh, messy realities of the world. And in the radiant spring of 1913, no one on earth seemed to embody that fairy tale more perfectly than Her Royal Highness, Princess Victoria Louise of Prussia. She was the German Kaiser's only daughter, the darling of a mighty empire, a young woman whose life seemed preordained for nothing but perpetual sunshine and splendor. Her wedding that May was the event of the century, a dazzling, almost blinding spectacle that brought together the crowned heads of Europe in a final, shimmering display of dynastic power and family unity. But if you were able to look closely past the glitter of the Romanov diamonds and the military gleam of the British Guards, you could see the hairline cracks already forming in the magnificent facade. For this glittering family reunion was, in truth, a gathering of ghosts at a final feast. Within a single year, these same royal cousins who smiled and posed for the cameras in Berlin would lead their nations into a catastrophic war that would not only devour a generation of young men, but would also utterly obliterate the gilded world that had created them. The story of Princess Victoria Louise is the story of what happens when the fairy tale shatters into a million pieces. It's a breathtaking, often shocking journey that takes us from the absolute pinnacle of imperial power to the cold desperation of exile, from a storybook wedding celebrated by the world to a deeply controversial relationship with the most monstrous regime of the 20th century. This is not a simple, sentimental tale of a fallen princess. It is a complex, profoundly disturbing, and deeply human story about the powerful bonds of loyalty, the deep scars of loss, and the devastating moral compromises made in the long, dark shadow of history. It's the story of a woman who was born to be an icon of a glorious past, but who would ultimately become a haunting and divisive symbol of its darkest, most well-kept secrets. To truly comprehend the life of Victoria Louise, you must first immerse yourself in the world she was born into. A world that, to us, seems almost impossibly distant, governed by rules we can barely fathom. This was the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era, that gilded age stretching from the late 19th century to the guns of August 1914. On the surface, it was an age of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and dizzying technological progress in Europe. But beneath this glittering, optimistic veneer, it was a world of rigid social hierarchies, simmering nationalist tensions, and immense, almost absolute power concentrated in the hands of a few ruling families who were, in a strange and ultimately fateful twist of history, nearly all related. The German Empire, forged in war and industry in 1871, was the new, ambitious powerhouse of Europe. It was an industrial giant with a military to match, and at its head, wielding immense personal power, was Victoria Louise's father, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser was one of the most complex and consequential figures of his time. He was intelligent and charming, but also deeply insecure, impulsive, and possessed by a bombastic, swaggering personality. This insecurity was rooted, in part, in a physical disability. He was born with a withered left arm, the result of a traumatic birth, an imperfection he spent his entire life trying to conceal and overcompensate for through militaristic posturing and an obsession with naval power. He harbored a deeply conflicted love-hate relationship with Great Britain. As the grandson of Queen Victoria, he craved British acceptance, Yet he was also fiercely jealous of their global empire. This psychological turmoil in the man who ruled Germany would have catastrophic consequences for the world. His wife, the Empress Augusta Victoria, known to the family as Donna, was his opposite. She was deeply religious, conservative, and a devoted mother, embodying the traditional German ideal of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. While the Kaiser was often away on state visits or military maneuvers, Donna was the anchor of the family, providing a stable, if strict, home life for their 7 children. Within this powerful patriarchal family, Victoria Louise held a unique and deeply cherished position. Born in 1892 at the Marble Palace in Potsdam, after her parents had already had 6 sons, she was an answer to her mother's prayers and the absolute apple of her father's eye. The stern, often difficult Kaiser, who frequently clashed with his male heirs, especially the Crown Prince Wilhelm, melted in the presence of his only daughter. He called her his sunshine, doting on her, spoiling her, and raising her to be the flawless embodiment of an imperial princess. In her, he saw a reflection of the perfection he felt he lacked. Her life was a carefully orchestrated performance, lived within the opulent but emotionally constricting walls of Berlin's palaces, a life designed to prepare her for a brilliant dynastic marriage. But even a fairy tale has its feuds and politics. For decades, the Kaiser's family, the mighty House of Hohenzollern of Prussia, had been bitter enemies with another great German royal house, the Guelphs of Hanover. In 1866, during the unification of Germany, Prussia had forcibly annexed the Kingdom of Hanover, deposing its king and sending the family into exile in Austria. This act created a deep and lasting wound in German aristocratic society. The heir to this deposed dynasty and the claimant to the lost throne of Hanover was the dashing Prince Ernest Augustus of Hanover, Duke of Brunswick. By the strange logic of royal destiny, it was this very man, the scion of her father's sworn enemy, with whom Victoria Louise would fall deeply and irrevocably in love. Their union was therefore more than just a romance. It was an act of high diplomacy, a powerful political statement, a chance to heal a wound that had festered for nearly half a century. And so, the stage was set for a wedding that was meant to symbolize peace and reconciliation, but would instead become history's most poignant and ironic farewell party. Her early life was a gilded paradox of extreme privilege and suffocating restraint. As the only girl in a sea of boisterous brothers, Victoria Louise was both endlessly pampered and profoundly isolated. While her 6 brothers were subjected to a rigorous, often brutal Prussian military-style education designed to forge them into soldiers, she was cocooned in a feminine world of governesses, ladies-in-waiting, and carefully curated experiences. She was fluent in several languages, a talented pianist, and an accomplished artist. But her education was designed not to foster independence, but to create the perfect royal consort. She became her father's constant companion, riding with him in the Tiergarten, accompanying him on the imperial yacht, and learning to navigate the treacherous currents of court life with grace and poise. This intense, almost suffocating bond with the Kaiser would become the defining relationship of her life, shaping her worldview, her unshakable loyalties, and her ultimate destiny. In 1912, that destiny arrived in the form of Prince Ernest Augustus. He had come to the court in Berlin on a somber mission to personally thank the Kaiser for a surprising gesture of compassion. Ernest's older brother had been killed in a car accident while serving in the Prussian army, and the Kaiser, in an act of chivalry, had sent 2 of his own sons to provide a full military escort for the body. This act of grace thawed the icy relations between the two houses and opened the door for Prince Ernest to be received at the palace. When he and the 20-year-old Victoria Louise met, the connection was instant and undeniable. It was a genuine love match, a fact that greatly pleased her father, who immediately grasped the immense diplomatic value of uniting the two rival dynasties. Their wedding, held on May 24, 1913, was the last great royal spectacle of the Old World. It was a global event. Berlin was transformed into a sea of German and Hanoverian flags. The ceremonies were a breathtaking display of imperial wealth and power. Over 1,200 guests, including the most powerful monarchs on earth, descended on the city. King George V of Great Britain and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, her father's first cousins, were there in their full, glorious military regalia. The bride herself was a vision, wearing a gown of white silk moiré, with a 10-foot train embroidered with myrtle, the traditional flower of a Hohenzollern bride. The wedding was a moment of seeming harmony, a family reunion on an imperial scale. But the photographs from that day are deeply, unbearably chilling to look at now. They show these powerful men who held the fate of millions in their hands, smiling and posing together, utterly oblivious to the abyss of fire and blood that was about to open beneath their feet. Just over a year later, in August 1914, the fairy tale ended with a horrifying abruptness. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo lit the fuse, and the complex, rigid web of military alliances dragged Europe into the Great War. Suddenly, cousin was pitted against cousin in a brutal, industrialized slaughter. Victoria Louise's husband and brothers went to the front to fight for Germany, while her royal relatives in Britain and Russia were now the hated enemy. As the Duchess of a ruling German state, Brunswick, she threw herself into war work, serving as a patron for military hospitals and Red Cross efforts. She experienced firsthand the growing hardships on the home front, the food shortages caused by the British blockade, the lists of casualties, the growing sense of dread. The war was a personal tragedy for her, tearing her family loyalties apart. But it was nothing compared to the cataclysm that was to come. For 4 years, the German Empire bled itself white. By the autumn of 1918, facing total military collapse and revolution at home, the German monarchy, which had seemed so permanent and unshakable just a few years earlier, crumbled in a matter of days. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate his throne and flee into exile in the Netherlands. For Victoria Louise, this was an unimaginable, soul-crushing trauma. Her father, the mighty emperor she adored, was now a reviled fugitive, blamed by the world for the war. Her world, her identity, her entire reason for being had been annihilated. She and her husband were also forced to abdicate their throne in Brunswick. At the tender age of 26, the Kaiser's pampered, beloved daughter became a princess without an empire. They retreated to their private estates, primarily the magnificent Blankenberg Castle in the Harz Mountains. While they had lost their throne, they retained significant personal wealth, vast lands, and considerable influence. During the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, Germany's first chaotic and ultimately doomed experiment with democracy, they lived a life of quiet, aristocratic splendor, raising their 5 children, 4 sons and a daughter named Frederica. But they, and many members of their class, never accepted the new republic. They saw it as a weak, decadent, and illegitimate regime born from the national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. They longed for a return to the old ways, for the restoration of order, tradition, and Germany's national pride. And it was this deep-seated reactionary desire that would lead them down a dark and morally treacherous path into the heart of the 20th century's greatest evil. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, a new political force was rising from the ashes of Germany's defeat, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. To many dispossessed and resentful aristocrats like Victoria Louise and her husband, the Nazis, with their fervent nationalism, their violent anti-communism, and their charismatic promises to restore German greatness, seemed like a potential, if somewhat vulgar, ally. This is the most shocking, damning, and controversial chapter of her life, one that is often deliberately ignored or glossed over in official biographies, and even in her own memoirs. While neither Victoria Louise nor her husband ever formally joined the Nazi Party, their proximity and active sympathy to the regime are an undeniable historical fact. They moved in the same elite circles as the Nazi leadership, provided significant financial support to the party in its rise to power, and saw Hitler's movement as a blunt instrument to achieve their own ends, the destruction of the Weimar Republic, and they desperately hoped a Hohenzollern restoration. This was not a passive association, it was an active embrace. Several of their sons were drawn into Nazi-affiliated organizations. Her own brother, Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia, known as Aui, was an early and enthusiastic Nazi, a member of the SA who used his royal status to lend an air of aristocratic legitimacy to the movement. This toxic entanglement was not a secret. It culminated in a moment of shocking public clarity, a rarely discussed incident that revealed just how far the family had strayed into the moral twilight. In January 1938, Victoria Louise's only daughter, Frederica, married Prince Paul, the heir to the Greek throne, in a lavish ceremony in Athens. It should have been a joyous occasion, a bright dynastic spot in a dark decade, but the guest list told a different, more sinister story. One of the most prominent German guests attending as Hitler's personal representative was Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, founder of the Gestapo, and one of the most powerful and ruthless figures in the Nazi regime. Photographs and newsreels from the event are profoundly jarring. They show the ancient streets of Athens adorned with both Greek flags and the Nazi swastika, flying side by side in an unholy alliance. Göring, corpulent and menacing in his white Luftwaffe uniform, is seen mingling easily with European royalty, the guest of honor at a royal wedding. For Victoria Louise, standing proudly as the mother of the bride, this was the ultimate visual confirmation of her family's accommodation with Hitler's Reich. The fairy tale princess was now breaking bread with the architects of the coming nightmare. The Second World War brought the ultimate tragic irony. The regime her family had courted in the hopes of restoring their own glory brought them only unimaginable grief. Two of her sons, Prince Christian and Prince George Wilhelm, were killed in action fighting for the Wehrmacht in the very war their leaders had unleashed. When the war finally ended in Germany's total defeat and destruction in 1945, the family faced a second, even more devastating exile. Their beloved Blankenberg Castle and most of their vast estates were located in what became Soviet-occupied East Germany. They lost everything. Once again, they were refugees, fleeing westward with what little they could carry, a princess who had begun her life in unimaginable splendor, ending up a displaced person in her own ravaged country. To see Victoria Louise as merely a political figure, a pawn in the great games of the 20th century, is to miss the powerful emotional currents that guided her life. At her core, she was defined by an unwavering, almost religious sense of loyalty. A loyalty to her class, her family, and above all, to her father. Throughout his long, lonely exile in Doorn, Netherlands, which lasted until his death in 1941, she remained his most devoted and faithful child. She visited him regularly, wrote to him constantly, and defended his legacy with fierce determination until her dying day. Her memoirs are filled with loving, deeply idealized portraits of the man she called Papa, the mighty, benevolent emperor of her youth. This intense father-daughter bond was the emotional anchor of her life, a constant in a world of violent, ceaseless change. It helps explain, though it can never excuse, many of her choices. Her political actions were often driven by a daughter's desperate, nostalgic wish to see her father's lost world restored. The private pain she endured was immense and multifaceted. The loss of her sons in the war was a grief from which she never fully recovered. To lose a child is a parent's worst nightmare. To lose them fighting for a criminal regime that ultimately brought your nation to utter ruin is a tragedy of almost Greek proportions. There is a deeply poignant, if somber, quote attributed to her that captures the weight of the past she carried throughout her long life. Our life is like a book. The title is our name, the preface to our birth, the contents are our actions, but the ending is always a mystery. For her, the contents of her book were filled with unparalleled grandeur and unspeakable grief, unimaginable privilege, and devastating loss. And the ending was far from the simple fairy tale she had been promised at the start. Eyewitness accounts from her later years, after the war, paint a picture of a formidable, proud, and often difficult woman, the living embodiment of a bygone era. She carried herself with an imperial air, even when living in much reduced circumstances in a modest house. She was, in effect, performing the role of the Kaiser's daughter for her entire life, a role she refused to relinquish even when the stage had been dismantled and the audience had gone home. This unshakable dedication to her past was both her greatest strength and her most profound tragedy. It gave her a powerful, unwavering sense of identity, but it also seemed to blind her to the moral complexities and horrors of the history she had lived through. Her personal stories are a constant, dizzying dance between the cherished memory of a perfect sunlit past and the harsh, dark reality of what that past had wrought. The most significant and unavoidable controversy surrounding Princess Victoria Louise is, without question, her family's relationship with the Nazi Party. This is not a matter of simple black and white judgment from the comfort of our 21st century morality. It is a complex and disturbing historical question that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human motivation, fear, and ambition. Were she and her husband cynical opportunists callously using the Nazis to try and regain power? Were they true believers in the fascist ideology, or were they naive, politically blinkered aristocrats desperately and foolishly trying to survive and protect their family in a dangerous and unpredictable time? The evidence for their collaboration is substantial and damning. They provided significant financial backing to the party in its early days, seeing it as a bulwark against the threat of communism. They attended high-profile Nazi events, lending their aristocratic prestige to the movement. Their sons were active in the military. Hermann Göring, one of the regime's chief architects, was a welcome and honored guest at their daughter's wedding. The association was so well known that some historians have referred to Victoria Louise with the damning moniker, the Brown Duchess, a play on her husband's title as Duke of Brunswick, linking her family directly to the brown-shirted thugs of the Nazi stormtroopers. However, a more nuanced, though no less troubling interpretation also exists. They never formally joined the Nazi Party. Their ultimate goal, born of nostalgia and entitlement, was the restoration of the Hohenzollern monarchy. This ambition was, in the long run, fundamentally at odds with Hitler's vision of a totalitarian Führer state. In their minds, and in the minds of many German conservatives, Hitler might have been a temporary, if distasteful, tool. He was the drummer who would rouse the nation, dismantle the hated republic, and crush the left, after which the traditional elites could sweep in and restore the Kaiser. This proved to be a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They woefully underestimated the man and the radical nihilistic movement they sought to use for their own ends. This controversy is made even more complex by Victoria Louise's own words, or rather, her silence. In 1977, late in her life, she published her autobiography, The Kaiser's Daughter. The book became a sensation and a bestseller in West Germany, tapping into a wave of nostalgia. It is a masterclass in the art of curated memory. In its pages, she paints a vivid, romantic, and deeply emotional picture of her life before 1914. She writes with passion and love of her father, her idyllic childhood, and the splendor and propriety of the imperial court, the years of the Nazi regime, the moral compromises, the difficult questions, the wedding in Athens, Hermann Göring. All of this is conspicuously, deafeningly absent. She smooths over the dark and difficult chapters, presenting a polished, sanitized version of her life for public consumption. This deliberate act of omission is in itself a powerful and revealing historical statement. Her memoir is not just a story, it is an argument, a final desperate attempt to control her own narrative and to ensure that she would be remembered as the fairy tale princess of 1913, not as a woman deeply entangled with one of history's darkest chapters. Her life also serves as a profound and chilling cautionary tale. It is a story about the inherent dangers of aristocratic entitlement and the seductive, corrupting belief that one is above the normal rules of politics and morality. Her family's willingness to ally themselves with the Nazis, born from a selfish and backward-looking desire to reclaim their lost status, is a chilling reminder of how easily traditional elites can make disastrous moral compromises when they feel their privilege is threatened. It demonstrates with terrifying clarity how the seductive promise of restoring a glorious past can be used by extremist movements to gain power, legitimacy, and ultimately to destroy a nation. Finally, her legacy did not end with her death. It flows quite literally through the veins of modern European royalty. Her daughter, Frederica, became the Queen of Greece. Through Frederica, Victoria Louise is the grandmother of Queen Sophia of Spain, and astonishingly, the great-grandmother of the current King of Spain, Felipe VI. The blood of the Kaiser's only daughter, carrying with it all the triumphs, traditions, and deep tragedies of German history, is now an integral part of the Spanish monarchy. Her story is not a closed chapter. It is a complex, often troubling inheritance that continues to shape the present in ways we rarely acknowledge. In the end, we are left with the haunting, indelible image of the girl from the 1913 wedding, a radiant princess standing on the sunlit precipice of a new life, embodying all the hope and glamour of a world that tragically believed in its own permanence. And we must place that bright, hopeful image alongside the woman she became, a grieving mother who lost her sons in a devastating war she had tacitly supported, a proud exile who lost her homeland not once but twice, and a historical figure forever and inextricably linked to a regime of unimaginable evil. Her life was a testament to the powerful, often destructive force of loyalty. Her unwavering devotion to her father and her class was the compass that guided her every action, but it led her into a moral wilderness from which her reputation would never and should never fully escape. She was a woman of a specific time and place, and her choices were shaped by a worldview of hierarchy, of duty, of entitlement that is now alien to us. Judging her is easy. To understand her is far more difficult, and ultimately far more rewarding. Her story resists simple labels. She was not merely a villain, nor was she purely a victim. She was a complex human being who lived through the most tumultuous and violent century in human history, navigating its treacherous currents with a potent mixture of pride, naivete, and a profound, heartbreaking nostalgia for a world that was gone forever. Her fairy tale did not have a happy ending, and it is in that tragic, unsettling, and deeply cautionary truth that the enduring power of her story lies.